I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1710 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about another reason why we went and stood up against the spread of communism in Vietnam. That reason I'm going to tell you about in this podcast episode is something known as the Viet Kieu. In Vietnamese, that means Vietnamese people from overseas. As you know, a lot of Vietnamese got out of Vietnam when the commies took over because they knew what was going to happen to them. Many of them were killed, their property was stolen, they were put in re-education camps, and many of them faced starvation. So guess what? Lots of them got out of there, and they did quite well. There is a story that appeared in the Euro Money website titled, International Finance, Vietnam's Diaspora Returns with Attitude. And by the way, for everybody down in East Palmdale, Florida, diaspora means the dispersion of any people from their original homeland. That started out as a reference to all those Jews who were run out of their homeland way back there. But today it means any group of people who are run out of their homeland. That's a perfect description of the Vietnamese who had to get out of town when the communists came in. From previous stories in this podcast, we know that the vast majority of those diaspora people from Vietnam did well wherever they went. A lot of them came to this country, but they went everywhere. A bunch of them went down to Australia, did well there. Some of them went back to France, did well there. Most of them did well wherever they went because they were facing starvation. They had to get out there and work. Many of these people who fled their homeland years ago are returning. Ever since Vietnam wised up and got rid of a communist economic system, ever since they did that, that country's been booming. The Viet Kieu people are returning and doing well. Many of them are making a lot of money back in their home country because it's booming there. I am not citing these people who have returned because they're going back home and getting stinking rich. I'm pointing them out because they were worth fighting for. They were good people. They were in bad shape. They needed a hand. In a roundabout way, we were successful. I'm going to share this story with you so that you can understand this dynamic that's going on over there in Vietnam. It was rough in the beginning for these people who were going home because the people who stayed weren't real friendly to them. But it's all changing now. They're all buddy-buddy, and things are looking good over there in Vietnam. I hear of more and more Vietnam veterans who are returning to Vietnam to retire because it's so nice there. And the Vietnamese people like them. I think that's wonderful. You're going to think it's wonderful too after you hear this story. So without any further ado, let's take a look at it. Again, it appeared on the Euro Money website. It was titled International Finance, Vietnam's Diaspora Returns with Attitude. It was submitted by Ellis of that website. The subtitle to the story is, The country's, referring to Vietnam, the country's financial system has been transformed over the last decade, and the Viet Kieu has played a crucial role in that. Euro Money speaks to some of its leading lights about what they are doing and why. Let's find out why. Dateline, Saigon, currently known as Ho Chi Minh City. International finance has its share of gripping personal sagas. The Rothschilds' role in shaping modern nations. the repeated rise and fall of Portugal's Espírito Santo family, and China's Cultural Revolution survivors who now run some of the world's biggest banks. But few financial centers boast as many compelling individual life stories among their banking ranks as Vietnam's commercial capital, Ho Chi Minh City, the thrusting port city that recent history knows better as Saigon. These stories are those of so-called Viet Kieu, the 500,000 or so foreign educated returnees to Vietnam from refugee families who fled South Vietnam during the 1970s and 1980s, part of the so-called boat people exodus, as the victorious communists of the North brutally unified the country after winning what they call the Resistance War and what the rest of the world knows as the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese diaspora numbers around 5 million internationally. They have made prosperous homes in places such as California's Orange County and Montreal's South Shore, and have transformed once gritty inner suburbs of Australian cities Melbourne and Sydney. According to data compiled by the Melbourne City Council, the common Vietnamese surname Nguyen is the second most listed after Smith among telephone subscribers. Pham Not Bich, Ho Chi Minh City Securities, says this: the conservative factions are getting older and older, and the younger generation are very business-oriented, very practical. There is a change happening. Today, the Viet Kieu are sprinkled across the country's young financial markets, running banks, private equity houses, fund managers, and securities firms, advising bureaucrats and helping modernize Vietnam's economy. They are also relatively youthful, 30 and 40-somethings, doing important jobs that glass ceilings might have excluded them from in the West so early in their careers. Their influence spreads beyond finance. Viet Kieu populate Vietnam's entrepreneurial ranks as managers of the nation's fashionable bars and restaurants, boutique stores, and art galleries. They are represented in professions such as architecture, design, and medicine, combining Western service standards with local sensibilities. Modern Vietnam's popular culture is heavily influenced by Viet Kieu, and with the diaspora's strong cultural emphasis on education, in part imbued by starting again refugee parents, Viet Kieu also provide a large talent pool for employers and investors in Vietnam. What could be better? An educated manager who speaks Vietnamese fluently. Back to the story. Western-minded, the Viet Kieu blend easily with Vietnam's burgeoning Doi Moi generation, the 20 to 30-somethings born locally after Vietnam's transformative adoption in 1986 of economic reforms that tilted the country away from a Marxist command economy to today's progressive embrace of the free market. That's right, the Vietnamese have found out, like many others, that communism is a bankrupt theory. It does not work. They're only able to foist it on a population because they use it like a drug. They tell the poor people in a country that we're going to take everything away from the rich people and give it to all the poor people. They don't tell them the rest of the story, but it's good enough to get the poor people of a country in some cases to accept the theory, much to their regret. That's what happened with the Vietnamese. They were smart enough to get rid of it. Unfortunately, they did not get rid of communism when it comes to personal freedoms in that country. But I feel they will someday be there, maybe sooner than we think. Continuing. Akin to the perestroika reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union and China's open-door policy of the late 1970s, those reforms were known in Vietnamese as doi moi, meaning to exchange, the doi part, with an implication of innovation, the moi meaning. That was a very good thing for Vietnam. Now they have an economy that's going great guns, even giving the Chinese a little run for their money. Back to the story. The Viet Kieu, More than 30 years on, Vietnam's Doi Moi generation does not bear the same wariness toward banks and technology as do their parents and grandparents, who have faced war, corruption, economic collapse, doctrinaire communism, and business nationalization. The Doi Moi generation is more open to foreign trends and fashions, particularly those drawn from the Viet Kieu. It's always easier for people to accept things from their own kind of people. That's what's happening in Vietnam. Indeed, such is the penetration of Viet Kieu in corporate Vietnam that an identifying linguistic marker has emerged in common parlance that distinguishes these returnees from locals. Although the diaspora and locals are ethnically Vietnamese, the diaspora returnees are identified by subsets like French Vietnamese, American Vietnamese, and so on. Vietnamese from a local non-refugee background, even if they've been educated abroad, tend to be identified as Vietnamese in day-to-day conversation. The distinction implies a different mindset. The Viet Kieu are seen to be inherently capitalist and carrying little of the ideological baggage of Hanoi's notionally communist government. Gathered mostly in Saigon, it's a rare Viet Kieu in Vietnam who doesn't have a poignant tale of personal sacrifice, of overcoming family distress and dislocation. Everyone here has a story, says Vietnamese-Australian investment manager Con Vu, who was 18 months old when he fled chaotic Vietnam by boat with a family in the late 1970s for a new life in Sydney. It is just a given, but no one much talks about it because we've all moved on. The country's moved on, and there's too much exciting stuff going on out there. Indeed, almost 2 generations on from the conflict, Vietnam has changed, and so has the attitude towards it of its prosperous diaspora and by local Vietnamese towards the country's Viet Kieu community. Quan Lee, Chief Partnership Officer at investment bank Ho Chi Minh Securities, remembers local opposition to Viet Kieu when he first returned to work in Vietnam in 2005 from Los Angeles, where he had been a marketing executive at Disney after fleeing Vietnam as a child. The first wave of returnees was seen, not unjustifiably in some cases, as arrogant carpetbaggers, he says. They were people who were drawn back by quick money, quick profits, but as Vietnam progressed, you see more and more professional people coming back here. Vinh Tuan Ngo, the French-Vietnamese head of investment banking at Viet Capital Securities, says, "There are other people who come here who were not very successful in the U.S. or elsewhere, and they come here like they are hot shots when they are not hot shots." Dominic Scriven, an Englishman who runs one of Vietnam's leading foreign investment firms, Dragon Capital, remembers that Viet Kieu were viewed with suspicion when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1990, soon after the so-called Doi Moi market reforms that transformed the economy. This was when there were still governments in exile in places like California, drawing support and funds from the diaspora and the U.S. government. Quan Lee said that when he was growing up in his adopted home in Orange County in Southern California, the strongest anti-war communist sentiment in the area's Vietnamese community, the biggest in North America, was akin to that in Florida among the anti-Castro community who had fled Cuba after the revolution in 1959. Don Lam of Vina Capital says this, "I was one of the boat people. I was hungry and thirsty all the time. My family thought I was crazy to go back. Diaspora Vietnamese were allowed into Vietnam for family reunions, but their business and social activities were restricted and closely monitored. Indeed, the early days of the Doi Moi reforms are littered with stories about how get-rich-quick diaspora businessmen pushed the reformist regime too far and came undone in corruption scandals." But around the late 1990s, said Scriven, he first began noticing government welcome home booths at airports directed at the Viet Kieu community with invitations to invest. I think they realized pragmatically that here was a potential pool of money and expertise, he says. Con Vu, deputy managing director of one of Vietnam's pioneer investors, Vina Capital, says he is often floored by the ignorance about Vietnam, including that of Vietnamese living abroad, that it is a war-torn, dangerous country. That was 1975. More than a generation ago, he says. It's such a forgiving, let's-move-on type environment. Making a difference. Vu's story is typical of many Viet Kieu. He fled Vietnam on a rickety refugee boat immediately after the war. His father, a pilot for the defeated South Vietnamese government's Air Force, captained the boat, which was crammed with hundreds of people, many of them South Vietnam's business elite and middle class. They made their way to refugee camps in Indochina and Malaysia, and eventually to God's country, Australia. Vu grew up speaking Vietnamese and English, studied commerce at college, and got a post-graduation job at Arthur Andersen, and then at Australian investment bank Macquarie, which transferred him to New York just as Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers were imploding in 2008. Vu took a year off and then joined Vina when it opened an office in Singapore. Returning to Vietnam in 2013, he says with his parents' blessing. They said to me, "Go back and make a difference." And he is. Vina Capital, founded in 2003 by another Viet Kieu, Canadian returnee Don Lam, is one of the biggest capital market investors in Vietnam, managing a combined $3.5 billion in funds on its own account and for international investors. When Vina Capital was launched, there were just 50 listed companies in the country. Today, there are more than 750, and the market capitalization is around $150 billion. Vu's colleague, Andy Ho, Vina's chief investment officer, is Vietnamese American, an MBA graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who returned to Vietnam 15 years ago with fund manager Prudential, one of the early Western investors in Vietnam's capital markets. Prudential today dominates the Vietnamese insurance and investment sector, and the country has been one of Pru's most successful diversifications. Indeed, Prudential had a policy of hiring Viet Kieu to its executive ranks through the 1990s and 2000s, and its alumni litter the business and banking ranks in Ho Chi Minh City. Ho says Vietnam has long moved away from doctrinaire Marxist-Leninism and says today's politicians and bureaucrats are more Western educated. Vietnam is probably the most global country in the world, the most free trade agreements than any other. Vietnamese people are very practical. They just want to make money, to get on with it. An aside here. I spent 2 years in Vietnam 50 years ago. I noticed the same thing back then. Vietnamese people were hardworking, honest, and they just wanted to make a better life for themselves and their family, and they are still doing it. And that's why I say they are one of the reasons we stood up against the spread of communism 50 years ago. I feel it was worth it. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1710 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you very much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?